Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. They say there are two kinds of storms in the West. The first kind screams across the plains, tearing up everything in its path and leaving silence in its wake. The second kind starts quietly, a forgotten girl, a whisper of injustice, a single spark in the dark. And that second kind of storm, when it finally breaks, leaves nothing behind but a world that has been changed forever. The town of Purgatory Flats was named by a drunk prophet, and somehow, the name had stuck. It wasn't hell, but it was damn sure the place you waited to get there. It was a dusty scar on the face of the earth, a collection of leaning, clapboard buildings that cowered under the relentless heat of the sun. The law here was an abstract concept, a joke told by men with shiny guns and tarnished souls. In Purgatory Flats, you were worth what you had, or what you could take. Maggie Dawson had neither. To her, Purgatory Flats was a cage without bars. At 18, she was a ghost in her own life, a creature of corners and lowered eyes. She had hair the color of wheat that had lost its shine to dust and neglect, and eyes the blue of a Wyoming sky that now only reflected the filthy floorboards of the Gilded Cage Saloon. She'd washed up in this town after the cholera took her parents, an orphan swept into the machinery of a world that had no use for the weak. The saloon was owned by a man named Jebediah, a corpulent creature with a gravy-stained mustache and the heart of a tax collector. He'd taken Maggie in, not out of kindness, but because he recognized an asset that could be exploited. She scrubbed the floors, washed the glasses, and endured the jeers and pinches of drunken men, all for a bed of straw in the storeroom and the scraps from the kitchen. Her fragile existence came to an end on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The town was buzzing with a new presence. Silas Granger had arrived. Granger wasn't just wealthy, he was a force of nature. He had built an empire from usury, crooked land deals, and a single-minded ruthlessness that made even the hardest of outlaws speak softly in his presence. He owned the largest ranch in the county, the Ironwood, and it was whispered he owned the sheriff, the judge, and half the businesses in town as well. He walked into the Gilded Cage like a king entering his sty. He was a tall, immaculately dressed man in a tailored black suit that looked absurd in the heat and grime of Purgatory Flats. He had sultan pepper hair, slicked back, and cold, gray eyes that didn't look at people so much as through them, assessing their value and their use. Maggie was mopping up a spilled beer when his polished boots stopped inches from her. She didn't look up. Her number one rule of survival was to be invisible. Well, Granger's voice purred, smooth as oil but cold as ice. What have we here, Jebediah? Just the help, Mr. Granger, Jebediah said, his voice using sycophantic charm. Useless. But she works cheap. Granger reached down, took Maggie's chin in his fingers, and forced her to look up at him. His grip was cool and strong as steel. His gray eyes dissected her, devoid of any warmth. He was inspecting a horse, a piece of furniture. She has a fine face under all that grime, Granger remarked. How much? Maggie felt the blood freeze in her veins. Jebediah blinked. How much, sir? Don't make me repeat myself, Granger said, the purr gone from his voice. The girl. What's her price? Jebediah, sensing an opportunity, tried to play coy. Well now, Mr. Granger, she's a hard worker. Granger cut him off. $10 silver. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement. In a corner of the saloon, a young man sat, having witnessed the entire exchange with smoldering eyes. It was Tommy Hayes. He had grown up with Maggie back in Wyoming. He'd come to Purgatory Flats looking for work, and finding his childhood friend in such a state had been a sickening blow. He was a good man, but he was also a penniless ranch hand, and he knew that to challenge Silas Granger was a death sentence. He balled his hands into fists under the table, helpless and ashamed. Jebediah, greedy and craven, folded. Sold. Granger released Maggie's chin and tossed a few clinking coins onto the bar. He took Maggie's upper arm, his fingers bruising her flesh. Come along, girl. As he pulled her from the saloon, Maggie's eyes swept the room and met Tommy's. He saw the desperation, the fear, but underneath it, he saw something else, something no one else in that room could. A tiny spark, a single hot coal smoldering in the ashes of her resignation. It was there for just a moment, and then it was gone, extinguished by the sheer terror of her situation. Granger took her to his Ironwood ranch. It was a place of magnificent and terrible scale. A massive, white-painted main house stood amidst irrigated lawns, an insult to the surrounding desert. It was flanked by outbuildings, barns, and bunkhouses for the dozens of cowboys and laborers in his employ. It was not a ranch, it was a fiefdom. Maggie's life had gone from one prison to another, but this one had gilded walls. Granger turned her over to his housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable, whose face looked like it had been carved from a lemon. "This is Maggie," Granger told her. "She's my new personal serving girl. Have her scrubbed, dress her in something decent, and teach her some manners." The next days were a nightmare of humiliation. Maggie was scrubbed, groomed, and dressed in gowns finer than anything she had ever seen. But the dresses were just a slave's livery. Mrs. Gable treated her with a cold contempt, and Granger was worse. He was not physically cruel. His cruelty was more refined. He would make her stand for hours while he worked, silent as a piece of furniture. He would have her perform pointless tasks, just to watch her obey. He would speak to her, but never look her in the eye, his voice dripping with a cold, dismissive disdain. He was breaking her, erasing any trace of the person she was, turning her into a pretty, empty doll, another possession in his vast collection. Maggie endured. On the outside, she was a model of submission. She lowered her eyes. She said, "Yes, Mr. Granger." She did everything he asked, without a word of complaint. Her meekness was her camouflage. But on the inside, the smoldering coal Tommy had seen was being fanned by a quiet, seething wind of hatred. Every insult, every dismissive glance, was another piece of kindling on the fire. She wasn't breaking. She was hardening. And she was watching. She learned the workings of Granger's empire. She listened to his conversations with his lawyer, with the corrupt town sheriff. She saw ruined ranchers come to beg him for an extension on a loan, only to be turned away with a cold smile. She saw how he exploited the Chinese laborers building the new railway line, paying them a fraction of what they were worth. She saw that his power was not born of respect, it was born of fear and debt. He had a web spun over the entirety of Purgatory Flats, and everyone was caught in it. And she, Maggie Dawson, who had been bought for $10 silver, was sitting right at the center of that web. One night, a week after her arrival, Granger called her into his study. He was drinking brandy and staring into the fire. "What are you thinking, girl?" he asked, his voice low and contemplative. "Nothing, sir," she said, her eyes on the floor. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Good. That's exactly what I want. A pretty face, with no thoughts. You're learning." He had no idea how much she was learning. She wasn't just learning to obey. She was learning her enemy. She was learning his weapons: money, influence, cruelty. And in the quiet of his opulent study, while the man who owned her believed he was breaking her, Maggie Dawson was quietly, secretly, planning a war. The storm was still quiet. It was still a cloud on a distant horizon, but it was gathering. And when it came, it would have her name. The Ironwood Ranch was a kingdom built on cruelty, and Silas Granger was its undisputed king. For Maggie, those first weeks were an education in the nature of power. She saw it wielded in the way the hardest of cowboys fell silent when Granger passed, in the way Sheriff Brody came to the ranch not to enforce the law, but to receive his orders. Power, Maggie learned, wasn't just guns and money. It was the absolute belief in one's right to take what one wanted. Granger continued her education. He forced her to learn how to walk, how to speak, how to pour his brandy just so. He bought her dresses of silk and satin, but they were not gifts. They were uniforms, markers of his ownership. He would parade her before his business associates. "This is Maggie, my ward. Isn't she a quick study?" He spoke of her as if she wasn't there, another ornament to decorate his wealth. Humiliation was his primary weapon. He never struck her. He didn't need to. A dismissive word, a cold glance, a casual reminder that she'd been bought for the price of a skinny chicken, these were his blows, and they left deeper scars than any fist. But Granger made a critical error. By bringing her into the heart of his world, he gave her an intimate view of its workings. She was not just a servant. She was an observer. She was in his study when he plotted to acquire a watered ranch by diverting the creek that fed it. She was listening from the shadows when he instructed Sheriff Brody to misplace a land deed. She saw the ledger he kept in a secret drawer in his desk, where he recorded every debt, every threat, every piece of corruption that had built his empire. Her gilded cage became her schoolhouse. She learned to read the slightest tells on a man's face, to distinguish between fear and respect, between loyalty and greed. She learned to move silently, to be invisible when she needed to be. She was accumulating knowledge, and knowledge, she was beginning to realize, was a form of power too. Meanwhile, Tommy Hayes was being consumed by his own helplessness. He had taken a job on a small ranch south of town, and every trip to Purgatory Flats for supplies was a mixture of hope and dread that he would see Maggie. He heard the whispers that Granger had a new ward, a beautiful girl he kept sequestered at the Ironwood. Tommy knew it was her, and the thought of what she must be enduring was a constant, dull ache of anger. He knew he couldn't confront Granger directly. That was suicide. But he couldn't do nothing. He began to talk, quietly, to the others who chafed under Granger's rule. The ranchers who had lost their land, the shopkeepers forced to pay protection money, the cowboys cheated out of their wages. He found a community of simmering resentment, a dry forest waiting for a spark. But they were afraid. They needed a leader, a symbol, and no one was willing to stand up. A month after her sale, Maggie got her first chance. Granger was hosting a grand party at the ranch, inviting politicians, bankers, and other men of influence from across the territory. It was a display of power, and Maggie was part of the display. She was dressed in a stunning dark blue gown and instructed to be silent, to smile, and to pour champagne. That night, Tommy was there. Not as a guest, but as a hired hand, brought on to help in the stables. He had taken the job for one reason, to see Maggie. As the party reached its peak, Maggie, on the pretense of fetching more wine, slipped out a back door. She made her way towards the stables, her heart hammering. She didn't know if Tommy would be there. It was a desperate hope. She found him in the shadows, grooming a horse. When he turned and saw her, a look of anguish and relief washed over his face. "Maggie," he breathed. "God, are you all right?" "I'm alive, Tommy," she said, her voice urgent and low. "But I'm not all right." "Displace him. You have to get out of here," he said, stepping towards her. "We could run. Head north. Start over." Maggie shook her head. A month ago, she might have agreed. But not now. "Run where, Tommy?" "He'd find me. His reach is everywhere." "Running isn't the answer." "Then what is?" he asked, desperate. Maggie looked back at the great house, its light and laughter spilling out. "The fire," she said, her voice cold. "You don't run from a fire. You put it out at the source." Tommy looked at her, and he saw that the girl he knew was gone. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something harder and brighter, a resolve as cold as steel. "What are you talking about, Maggie?" "I'm talking about taking back what he's stolen," she said. "Not just from me. From everyone. From the ranchers he's ruined. From the town he's strangling. I'm on the inside, Tommy. I see everything. I know his secrets. I know his weaknesses." She told him about the ledger, about the deals, about the web of corruption. As she spoke, Tommy realized this was not a broken girl. This was a warrior, rising. "You can't do this alone," he said, his voice full of concern. "I know," she said. "That's why I need you, Tommy. I need your eyes and ears on the outside. You talk to the others. Do they listen?" "They're scared," he admitted. "So am I," Maggie said, and for a flash, he saw her vulnerability again. "But I would rather die fighting than live as his pet." She looked him straight in the eye, and he saw that coal, now a bright flame. "Tell them there's hope. Tell them the walls have cracks. Tell them a storm is coming." Before he could answer, they heard Mrs. Gable's voice calling her name. Maggie had to go. She put her hand on his arm for a fleeting second. "Trust me, Tommy, and make them trust." She vanished back into the party, leaving Tommy standing in the darkness, his heart thrumming with fear and a sense of awe. A storm. He had seen it in her eyes. And he knew, like it or not, he was about to be swept up in it. The secret meeting with Tommy lit a fuse in Maggie. Hope was no longer an abstract idea. It had a face and a name. She was no longer alone in her cage. But she knew that talk and promises wouldn't be enough to sway the men and women terrorized by Silas Granger. They needed a sign. They needed to see that his empire was not infallible. They needed a spark to prove a fire could be started. Maggie began to look for her opportunity. She had to be careful. An open act of rebellion would be a death sentence. Her attack had to be subtle, a knife in the dark that no one could trace back to her. The chance came in the form of a land deal. Granger had been coveting a piece of property known as Cottonwood Springs for months. It was owned by the Miller family, a stubborn clan who had refused all his offers. The land wasn't particularly fertile, but it had the one thing that mattered in this arid country, the only reliable source of water for 20 miles. The spring fed not only the Millers, but half the small ranches on the east side of Purgatory Flats. To control Cottonwood Springs was to control the life and death of a dozen families. Maggie, while cleaning Granger's study, overheard him outlining his final plan. He had found a legal loophole, an old, forgotten clause in the Millers' original deed. With the help of a corrupt judge in the territorial capital, he was filing a claim, and by the end of the week, the land would be his. He boasted to his lawyer that he would fence the spring and charge a king's ransom for every gallon. By spring, he chuckled, they'll be begging me to buy their land for pennies on the acre. Maggie felt a cold dread. This wasn't just greed, it was pure, calculated cruelty. And she knew this was her chance. The packet of legal documents arrived on a Thursday, delivered by courier from the capital. It contained the signed claim, the court order, and the new deed. Granger placed it in the center of his desk, a monument to his impending victory. Tomorrow, he said to Maggie, who stood silently in the corner, Sheriff Brody and I will pay the Millers a visit. I want you to come along. I want you to see how the world really works. That night, Maggie did not sleep. She waited until the house was silent, until Granger's snores echoed from the master bedroom. Then she moved. She slipped down the stairs, a ghost moving through her own familiar house. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She entered the study. Moonlight streamed through the window, a silver slash across the mahogany desk. There, the packet lay. She could burn it, but that would be too obvious. Granger would know it was sabotage and would fly into a rage. No, her plan was more subtle. She carefully broke the wax seal with a small letter opener. She laid out the documents. She did not destroy them. She altered them. Her father had been a schoolteacher, and he had taught her a fine, elegant script. She had spent hours studying Granger's flamboyant signature on other papers. With a pen and an inkwell, and a hand that she prayed would not shake, she went to work. She added a clause to the new deed. A small clause, written in the dense legalese she had picked up from listening to Granger's conversations. The clause stipulated that while ownership of the land was being transferred, the water rights to Cottonwood Springs would remain in the public domain in perpetuity, to be managed by an elected board of 3 local landowners, ensuring fair and free distribution to all existing ranches within the watershed. It was an audacious piece of legal sabotage. Then, she performed the second part of her plan. She took a clean sheet of paper and carefully forged Granger's signature again, but this time at the bottom of a short, simple letter. The letter was addressed to Judge Peters, Granger's corrupt friend, and it simply stated that he had decided, as an act of goodwill to his new neighbors, to formalize the existing water rights. It would make the act look like Granger's idea, a sudden fit of generosity. She folded the new deed, placed the forged letter on top of the packet, and resealed the whole bundle with melted wax. It looked untouched. She placed it back exactly where she had found it and slipped back to her bed. The next morning, Granger, Sheriff Brody, and Maggie rode out to the Miller Ranch. It was a modest place, but clean and well kept. Mr. Miller, a man with a weathered face and resolute eyes, met them at the gate, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Granger, Miller nodded. I assume you're not here for coffee. Hardly, Miller, Granger said, a triumphant smirk on his face. I'm here to take possession of my property. He handed Miller the documents. Maggie stood behind Granger, her face a mask of subservience, but her heart was hammering. Mr. Miller read the documents, his face growing paler. He was beaten, but then he got to the close about the water rights. Confusion, then utter disbelief, washed over his face. He read it twice, then looked at Granger. What kind of joke is this? Miller demanded. No joke, Granger said, not having read the fine print himself. The land is mine. The law says so. It says the spring belongs to everyone, Miller said, his voice full of disbelief. Granger snatched the paper from Miller's hand. He read the clause. His face went through a spectrum of emotions from confusion to anger to absolute, incandescent rage. His eyes looked like they might shoot flames. He knew something had happened, but he couldn't fathom how. The documents had been sealed. The signature was his. The letter to Judge Peters confirmed his generous intent. He was trapped by his own legal machinations. If he challenged it now, he would look like a fool and a liar before the entire territory. His act of goodwill was on the record. "It seems I was overgenerous in my haste," Granger said, his voice tight with the effort of control. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Miller." He wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the Ironwood, leaving behind a bewildered Sheriff Brody and an astounded Miller family. On the ride back, he did not speak a word to Maggie, but she could feel the fury radiating off him. He knew he had been played, but he had no proof. He would look at her, a sharp, cutting glance, searching for a sign of triumph, a flicker in her eyes. Maggie kept her face blank, her eyes lowered in her accustomed submission. She was the invisible, harmless serving girl. But inside, a spark had been struck. The news of Granger's unexpected generosity spread through Purgatory Flats like a wildfire. For the first time, Silas Granger had been beaten. He had tried to take their lifeblood and had, somehow, failed. No one knew how, but it had happened. That evening, Tommy Hayes paid a visit to the Millers. Mr. Miller told him the incredible story. They didn't understand it, but they were grateful. "It's a miracle, Mrs. Miller said." Tommy looked toward the Ironwood Ranch, a dark shape on the horizon. He knew it wasn't a miracle. It was a message. It was the first spark, and he knew who had lit it. The storm was beginning to whisper its name. Silas Granger's defeat at Cottonwood Springs sent a tremor through Purgatory Flats. It wasn't a tidal wave of open rebellion, more a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Each suffocating blanket of fear over the town had lightened, replaced by a thread of incredulous hope. For the first time, the almighty God of Purgatory Flats had proven to be fallible. For Granger, the public humiliation was a deeper wound than any financial loss. He became even more tyrannical and paranoid. He stalked his study, examining the documents a dozen times, trying to work out how he had been outmaneuvered. His suspicion fell on everyone: his lawyer, the judge, and especially on his silent, submissive serving girl. He watched Maggie like a hawk, searching for any sign of duplicity. But Maggie had become a master of invisibility. She was a blank mirror, reflecting back only what he wanted to see, a broken, obedient girl. His suspicions had nowhere to land, and it only made him angrier. His rage had no target, and it began to spill out, poisoning everyone in his orbit. Maggie knew that one small victory was not enough. The spark would die if it wasn't fed. She needed to turn the simmering resentment in the town into an organized fire. She needed an alliance. She began to use her position as a weapon. When Granger sent her to town on errands to fetch his special cigars, to deliver a message to one of his lackeys, she used those precious moments of freedom. She began to speak, not in words, but in signs. She would leave a leftover piece of bread for the hungry children of a ruined rancher. She would accidentally drop a penny where a Chinese railroad worker could find it. She would slip some medicine from Granger's own cabinet to one of the ailing saloon girls. They were small acts of kindness, but in a place as starved as Purgatory Flats, they were acts of rebellion. She was building a network of gratitude and trust, one person at a time. Tommy Hayes was her general on the outside. Emboldened by the victory at Cottonwood Springs, he began to speak more openly. He would meet men in the saloons, not for drink, but for conversation. He would visit the outlying ranches, not just to trade horses, but to take the measure of a man's anger. He spoke of Maggie, not as a revolutionary, but as a symbol. "She's still in there, right in the lion's den," he would say, his voice low. "If a girl like that ain't lost hope, what right do we have?" Their alliance began to form around an unlikely core. There was Mr. Miller, whose quiet respect in the farming community had now become a fierce loyalty. There was a woman named Mei Lin, the unofficial cook and matriarch of the Chinese labor camp. She was a tiny, ancient woman with eyes that saw everything, and she hated Granger for his exploitation of her people. And there was a man they called Preacher Jones, an old prospector who had lost his claim to Granger in a crooked card game, and now quoted scripture and spoke of divine retribution to anyone who would listen. They were a motley crew: a farmer, a cook, a half-mad prophet, and a ranch hand. But they all had one thing in common: they had been wronged by Silas Granger, and they were tired of being afraid. Their first meeting took place in the abandoned church at the edge of town, a building that even God seemed to have forsaken. By the light of a flickering candle, Tommy laid out what Maggie had discovered: the extent of Granger's corruption, the existence of the ledger. "That knowledge is useless unless we can use it, Mr. Miller said, his voice practical. "We need proof. We need that ledger." It was an impossible task. The ledger was kept in Granger's study, the most heavily guarded room in the entire Ironwood Ranch. "I can get it," a voice said from the shadows. Maggie stepped into the candlelight. She had slipped away from the ranch, an incredible risk, to be at this meeting. The others in the room stared. This was the woman they had heard about, the symbol, the spark. To see her there, thin but unafraid, hardened their own resolve. "How?" asked Maylin, her sharp eyes appraising her. "I live there," Maggie said simply. "I know the routines. I know the blind spots. But I'll need a diversion. A big one, enough to pull everyone, including Granger, away from the house." They began to plan. It was a desperate, risk-filled scheme. Preacher Jones provided the idea. Granger had a large warehouse at the edge of town where he hoarded the goods he had foreclosed on from his debtors. It was filled with hay, grain, and, most importantly, his pride. "A fire," the preacher said, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. "The wrath of the Lord visited upon the storehouses of the wicked." It was a dangerous idea. Arson. But it would work. A fire at Granger's warehouse would bring every man in town running, including Granger himself and Sheriff Brody. It would create the chaos Maggie needed. They set the time, 3 nights later, during the town's annual fall festival, an event that even Purgatory Flats held to pretend they were a civilized community. The town would be crowded and loud. The chaos would mask their actions. For the next 3 days, each member of the Alliance played their part. Mr. Miller and his fellow farmers accidentally left leaky barrels of kerosene near the warehouse. Maylin used her network to spread rumors of an impending brawl at the festival, to ensure the sheriff's deputies would be distracted. Tommy prepared a fast horse, hiding it in a copse of trees outside the Ironwood for Maggie's escape. Maggie, meanwhile, played the most dangerous part. She had to secure access to the study. She accidentally spilled an inkwell on Granger's study key, which he always carried. As she cleaned it, she quickly pressed the key into a small bar of soap hidden in her palm, making a perfect impression. She then passed the impression to Maylin on a quick trip to town, and Maylin had a sympathetic Chinese locksmith fashion a duplicate. The night of the festival arrived. The air was full of tinny music and drunken laughter. Maggie stood beside Granger on the hotel balcony, observing the crowds. Outwardly, she was calm and submissive. Inwardly, every nerve was stretched taut. Just after 10 o'clock, a cry went up. "Fire! Granger's warehouse is on fire!" An orange glow lit up the night sky. The plan was in motion. Everyone began to run towards the warehouse. Granger swore and stormed down the stairs, Sheriff Brody at his heels. In the chaos, no one noticed the small serving girl slip away in the opposite direction, toward the now unguarded Ironwood Ranch. The time had come. Their unlikely alliance had launched its first major offensive, and Maggie Dawson, with a copied key in her hand, was going to get the weapon that would bring down a king. The sky over Purgatory Flats was a sickly orange, the flames from Granger's warehouse licking at the night. The sounds of shouting and a clanging fire bell filled the air, a symphony of chaos. For Maggie, it was the music for the most dangerous act of her life. She ran not towards the fire, but away from town, towards the quiet darkness where Tommy had hidden the horse. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a frantic beat of fear and exhilaration. Everything depended on the next few moments. She found the horse, a fast mare, and galloped towards the Ironwood. The ranch, usually a bustling hub of activity, was eerily silent. Granger, in his rage and arrogance, had made a critical tactical error. He had taken nearly every hand with him to fight the fire and hunt for the saboteurs. He had left his kingdom virtually undefended. Maggie tied the horse in a grove of trees and crept towards the house. The big white mansion was silent and dark, save for a single lamp left burning in the main hall. She let herself in through the back kitchen door, the copied key in her hand, feeling cold and heavy. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. She moved through the familiar rooms, not as a servant, but as an intruder, a thief in the night. She reached the study. The door was locked, as she knew it would be. She slid the copied key into the lock. For one terrifying moment, it didn't turn. She held her breath, tried again, and this time, with a soft click, the lock gave way. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The room was dark, lit only by the distant, flickering glow of the fire. It smelled of leather, cigars, and rotten powder. She went to the desk where she had spent hundreds of hours standing in silent servitude. She knew exactly where to look. An ornate piece of carving on the front of the desk, when pressed just so, released a secret drawer. She found the catch and pressed. With a soft snick, the drawer slid open. And there it was. The ledger. A thick, plain, leather-bound book. The heart of Granger's empire. She took it. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of all the sins within. She had no time to read it. She had to get out. As she turned to leave, a figure materialized in the doorway. Maggie's heart stopped. It was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She stood there in her nightgown, a candle in her hand, her severe face lit from below, making her look like a spectral mask. "I thought I heard a noise, Mrs. Gable said, her voice cool and emotionless. Her eyes dropped to the ledger in Maggie's hands, and a flicker of understanding crossed her face. So, the little mouse has teeth after all. Maggie stood frozen, trapped. Mrs. Gable would scream. It would all be over. "He took everything from me, Mrs. Gable said, her voice a dry, barely audible whisper. "My husband. He owned a small ranch to the north. Granger wanted it. He ruined him, drove him into debt, and finally, into an early grave." She looked up, and for the first time, Maggie saw something other than coldness in her eyes. A deep, simmering pain. "I've worked for him for 10 years, hoping one day to see him destroyed. I just never thought his destruction would have wheat-colored hair and the eyes of a doe." Mrs. Gable stepped back from the doorway. "Go, child," she whispered, "and make sure you burn it all to the ground." Maggie stared at her, stunned. An ally in the most unexpected of places. She nodded, a silent thanks, and slipped from the room. She made it out of the house without further incident and galloped back to town, the ledger tucked safely under her cloak. The fire at the warehouse was being brought under control, but the chaos remained. She made her way to the abandoned church, where her alliance was waiting anxiously. She entered, her face smudged with soot, and placed the ledger on the makeshift altar. "I have it," she breathed. They gathered around, and by the light of the candles, they opened the book. It was worse than they had imagined. Every page was an indictment of Granger's greed and cruelty. The names of ranchers who had been cheated out of their land. The bribes paid to Sheriff Brody and Judge Peters. A systematic plan to control every business in town. There were even notes about the accidents that had befallen those who had stood up to him. It was a roadmap of his evil. It was their weapon. "With this, Mr. Miller said, his voice full of awe, "we can bring him down." "Not with the law in Purgatory Flats," Tommy said bitterly. "Brody and the judge are his men." "Then we don't use their law," Maggie said, her voice hard. She had changed in the last few hours. The fear had been burned away, leaving only a cold, steely resolve. "We use this to show the people the truth. We show them the chains they're wearing. We don't ask for justice. We take it." But as they were planning their next move, the news came. Preacher Jones, who had volunteered to stay behind and watch Granger, burst into the church, his face pale with fear. "Granger. He's on his way back," he gasped. "The fire's almost out." And he found something in the ashes. A half-melted key. A copy. He knows it was a setup. He knows there was a break-in. And he knows who did it. A cold silence fell over the room. "How could he know?" Tommy asked. "Mrs. Gable," the preacher said, his voice breaking. "They found her in the house." He questioned her. Before she died, she told him everything. Maggie felt an icy chill go down her spine. Mrs. Gable's act of defiance, her act of sacrifice, had saved her, but it had also condemned her. "He's gathering all his men," the preacher said, his voice frantic. "He's not looking for arsonists anymore. He's on a hunt, and he's coming for Maggie." The ledger was free, but it had unleashed the beast. The fight was no longer a battle in the shadows. It was about to become an open war, and Maggie Dawson, with the proof of her enemy's crimes in her hands, was now the most wanted person in Purgatory Flats. The news of Mrs. Gable's death and Granger's impending wrath fell on their small alliance like a hammer blow. The euphoria of their victory was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the war they had started. They had poked the bear, and now it was coming for blood. Preacher Jones was trembling. His fanatical zeal evaporated into terror. Even the stoic Mr. Miller had a grim, tight-lipped expression. "We underestimated his savagery," he said, his voice low. "Child, you must go. Take the ledger and run. We'll try to slow him down." All eyes turned to Maggie. They expected her to be afraid, to take their offer. But the woman who stood before them was no longer the timid girl they had met. Mrs. Gable's death had changed her. It had not broken her. It had tempered her into steel. Her sacrifice could not be for nothing. "Run where?" Maggie asked, her voice quiet but resonant in the silent church. "There is no place in this world men like him can't reach. We've seen that. The time for running is over." She placed her hand on the ledger. "This is not just about my survival anymore. This is the proof of his crimes against all of us. Against Mrs. Gable's husband. Against the preacher's claim. Against Mr. Miller's land. Against the wages of the Chinese workers. We can't run from it. We have to use it." "Use it how?" Tommy asked, his voice fraught with worry. "Granger will tear this town apart. He'll torture every soul in it until he finds you. Then we make sure that when he finds me, the entire town is standing with me," Maggie said. A plan, audacious and desperate, was forming in her mind. "We don't hide this book. We publish it." She laid out her scheme. It was simple and incredibly dangerous. They would not fight Granger with guns, not at first. They would fight him with the truth. They spent the rest of the night working in a fever. Mr. Miller, with his clear, steady hand, copied the most damning pages of the ledger onto loose sheets of paper. He copied the list of illegally foreclosed debts, the bribes paid to Brody, the plan to divert Cottonwood Springs. While he worked, Maggie, Tommy, Maylin, and the preacher ventured out into the chaotic town. Granger and his men were on a rampage, going from saloon to saloon, dragging men into the street, demanding information. But they were looking for an individual, a lone saboteur. They didn't realize they were fighting an idea. Under the cover of darkness and confusion, Maggie's small band began to sow the whispers of rebellion. They posted the copied pages from the ledger on every public surface door of the general store, the posts of the sheriff's office, and even the front door of the hotel where Granger kept the suite. Maylin slipped into the camp of the Chinese laborers and translated the details of how Granger had cheated them, showing them in black and white the wages that had been stolen. Preacher Jones, his courage restored, stood on a barrel and began to preach, not from the Bible, but from the ledger of sins, reading aloud Granger's crimes to anyone who would listen. Tommy went to the ranchers and small farmers. He didn't just show them the papers, he reminded them of their strength. "He's one man," he told them. "Look how many of us there are." It was an information blitz, a psychological assault. By the time the sun rose on Purgatory Flats, the town was a different place. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with a new, potent emotion, anger. People were no longer whispering about Granger's power. They were pointing at the papers plastered on the walls and whispering about his crimes. The truth was out, and it was an ugly thing. Granger, returning from a fruitless night of searching, saw what they had done. His fury was biblical. He ordered his men to tear down the papers, but it was too late. The word was out. He could feel the change in the way people looked at him, no longer with pure fear, but with a cold contempt. He had lost his greatest weapon, his aura of invincibility, and he knew who was responsible. "Find that girl," he hissed at Sheriff Brody. "I don't care about the book anymore. I want her dead." The hunt for Maggie became frantic. Brody and Granger's men went door to door, breaking down doors, terrorizing the populace. But they were met with a wall of silence. The town, now armed with the truth, had quietly turned against its oppressors. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Maggie, hidden by the very people she was fighting for, moved from house to house, sheltered by her growing alliance. She hid in a blacksmith's cellar, in the attic of a Chinese laundry, in an empty boxcar. She had become a symbol, a ghost of rebellion that Granger couldn't find. She knew this silent standoff wouldn't last. Granger would escalate. His brutality would increase until the town broke. She had to force his hand. She sent one last message, delivered to Granger by a street urchin. It contained just 6 words. Town Square. High noon. Alone. It was a challenge. An invitation to a duel, not of guns, but of wills. She would face him, openly, before the entire town. She was betting everything on the belief that the people of Purgatory Flats, now armed with the truth, would no longer stand by and let tyranny win. The whispers of rebellion were about to become a roar. Maggie's challenge fell upon Silas Granger like a slap in the face. A public confrontation. In the town square. The idea was so audacious, so unbelievable, that for a moment, Granger actually laughed. The mouse he had bought for $10 silver was now roaring like a lion. But his laughter died quickly, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. This girl wasn't just defying him, she was mocking him. She was turning his hunt into a farce. He had spent 2 days tearing the town apart, terrorizing the populace, only to be summoned to a meeting by a penniless girl as if he were some common errand boy. It's a trap, warned Sheriff Brody, a man of limited imagination. Of course it's a trap, you fool, Granger hissed. But it's one we're going to turn back on her. Granger had no intention of meeting Maggie alone, but he couldn't refuse either. To do so would be a sign of weakness, an admission before the whole town that he was afraid of a girl. No, he would go, but he would go on his terms. As noon approached, a strange, expectant hush fell over Purgatory Flats. Shops closed. The saloons fell silent. People began to gather at the edges of the town square, their faces a mixture of fear and a morbid, irresistible curiosity. They had seen the pages of the ledger. They had heard the whispers. Now they had come to see the final act. At the stroke of noon, Maggie Dawson stepped into the center of the square. She was not the timid serving girl anymore. She wore a simple shirt and trousers, the clothes of a working person, not a doll. Her hair was tied back practically. She carried no gun. She carried only one thing, Granger's ledger. She stood alone in the center of the dusty expanse, her back straight, her chin high, and waited. A few minutes later, Granger arrived. He did not come alone. He was flanked by Sheriff Brody and 10 of his most heavily armed men. They marched into the square like a firing squad, their rifles held in a menacing posture. They formed a semicircle around Maggie, penning her in. "You've made a grave error coming here, girl," Granger said, his voice dangerously smooth. "The only error was believing these people would tolerate your tyranny forever," Maggie replied, her voice ringing out clear across the silent square. She was speaking to him, but she was playing to the town. "This town is mine," Granger sneered. "These people, they are sheep, and I am the wolf." "You're mistaken," Maggie said. "They are not sheep. They are men and women who have been pushed too far." She held up the ledger. "And this is the proof of how you pushed them." Granger's patience snapped. "This farce is over. Give me the book, and I might grant you a quick death." "This book doesn't belong to me anymore," Maggie said. "It belongs to them." She looked to the crowd, her eyes seeking the faces of her alliance. She saw Mr. Miller, standing with a group of grim-faced farmers. She saw Maylin, standing with her workers, their eyes hard. And she saw Tommy, standing near the front, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. Their plan was that if Granger made a move, they would act. But still they hesitated, paralyzed by years of fear and the overwhelming show of force. Granger saw their hesitation and smiled. He knew he had won. "Look, girl, your saviors. They will do nothing. They are too weak." To prove his point, he decided a price had to be paid. A price for defiance. He couldn't kill Maggie outright. It would be too obvious. But he could break the spirit of the rebellion with a single, calculated act of cruelty. He scanned the crowd, and his cold eyes settled on Tommy Hayes. Granger had an excellent memory. He remembered the young man from the saloon the day he had bought Maggie. He had heard the whispers that Hayes was her friend, her mouthpiece. "Him," Granger said, pointing a long finger at Tommy. "Bring him to me." 2 of Granger's men plunged into the crowd and dragged out a struggling Tommy. They threw him on the ground at Granger's feet. "This is the price of sedition, girl," Granger said, drawing his own silver-inlaid pistol. This is what happens to those who whisper in the dark. Watch closely. He leveled the pistol at Tommy's head. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Maggie felt a cold dread wash over her. This she had not anticipated. She was prepared to die for her cause, but she had never intended for others to die for her. No, she cried out. The bargain was with me. The bargain has changed, Granger said, a cruel smile on his face. He was enjoying this. He would not just kill his enemy. He would force her to watch her only friend die. He cocked the hammer. In that moment, something inside Maggie snapped. All the planning, all the strategy, all the appeals to reason, it all fell away, leaving only a single, primal emotion, rage. She did what no one, least of all herself, expected. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She attacked. She launched herself forward, not at Granger, but at the gunman nearest to her. She moved with a stunning, explosive speed, and before the man could react, she had wrenched the rifle from his hands. She spun, levered around into the chamber, and fired, all in one fluid, practiced motion. She did not shoot at Granger. That would be too easy a shot, and she knew his men would cut her down instantly. She shot at the rope holding the large Granger Mercantile sign that hung over the general store, directly above Granger's head. The rope snapped. The heavy, 10-foot wooden sign came crashing down. It didn't hit Granger, but it struck the two men standing on either side of him, crushing them to the ground in a tangle of splintered wood and agonized screams. Chaos erupted. Maggie's sudden, violent act was the spark the crowd had been waiting for. Their hesitation evaporated, replaced by a wave of collective fury. Mr. Miller and his farmers surged forward, not with guns, but with fists and farm tools. The Chinese laborers, led by Mei Lin, charged from the other side, a human wave of anger. The town square became a riot. Granger, shocked by the sudden turn of events, was caught off guard. Tommy, seizing the opportunity, drove his shoulder into Granger's legs, knocking him off balance. Maggie, meanwhile, was no longer a strategist. She was a storm. She used the rifle not as a ranged weapon, but as a club, swinging, smashing, creating a space around herself and Tommy. Granger's men, outnumbered and attacked from all sides, fell apart. They were bullies and hired guns, not soldiers. Their loyalty was only as deep as Granger's pockets. Faced with a town in open revolt, they broke and ran. In minutes, it was over. A few of Granger's men lay groaning on the ground. The rest were gone. Sheriff Brody had been among the first to flee. In the center of the chaos stood Silas Granger. He got to his feet, his face a mixture of rage and utter disbelief. His empire had crumbled around him, brought down not by an army, but by the girl he had dismissed and the town he had despised. He looked at Maggie, who stood breathing heavily, the rifle in her hands, surrounded by the townspeople who now looked at her with awe. "You," he hissed, his voice full of venom. He still had his pistol. He raised it for one last, defiant shot. But before he could pull the trigger, a rock, thrown from the crowd, struck him in the side of the head. He staggered. Another followed. Then another. The crowd, which had been silent for so long, had found its voice. It was a voice of rage, and they rained it down upon their oppressor. Silas Granger, the king of Purgatory Flats, went down under a hail of stones and fists, beaten not by a single bullet, but by the collective weight of the hatred he had sown. The price of defiance had been paid, but not by Maggie or Tommy. It had been paid by Granger himself. The riot was not an organized event. It was a detonation, a raw, primal release of emotion. When the dust settled and a shocked silence fell over the town square, the people of Purgatory Flats stood amidst the wreckage of the old order, breathing hard and uncertain, like survivors of a hurricane. Silas Granger was not dead, but he was worse. Beaten, broken, and humiliated, he was dragged to his own jail, thrown into a cell by the same townspeople who had reclaimed the sheriff's office. His power was shattered. His aura was extinguished. He was just a bitter old man in a dirty room. In the power vacuum, all eyes turned to Maggie Dawson. She stood at the center of it all, the rifle still in her hand, Tommy at her side. She had not sought leadership, but it had been thrust upon her. With one singular act of defiance, she had become the heart and soul of their rebellion. The days that followed were a period of chaos and uncertainty. The town was without law, without leadership. It could have easily descended into anarchy, a power struggle between different factions. But Maggie would not let that happen. She had not fought to overthrow one tyrant just to see another rise. She began the process of forging the storm. With Tommy, Mr. Miller, and Malin, she formed a provisional town council. Their first order of business was to deal with the immediate aftermath. They seized Granger's assets, not to enrich themselves, but to return what had been stolen. The ledger became their map to justice. They visited every rancher named within its pages and solemnly handed back their land deeds. They calculated the wages the Chinese laborers had been cheated of and paid them from Granger's coffers, with a formal apology from the town. The shopkeepers were released from their predatory debts. It was a radical redistribution of wealth and power. Maggie did not rule by force, she ruled by fairness. For the first time, the law in Purgatory Flats was not the weapon of the strong, but the shield of the weak. But there were challenges. Granger's loyalists, the men who had profited from his corruption, did not give up quietly. They tried to stir up trouble, to sow dissent. One night, a group of them attempted to break Granger out of the jail. That's when Maggie proved she was not just a reformer, she was a protector. She and Tommy, backed by a volunteer militia of grateful farmers and workers, confronted them. There was no shootout. Maggie simply faced the ringleaders, her blue eyes as cold as steel. Granger's era is over, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. This town belongs to its people now. You can join us in building something new, or you can leave. But if you try to tear down what we are building, we will crush you. They saw the resolve in her eyes, and they backed down. They knew she wasn't bluffing. Maggie was learning how to wield power, and she found it to be both a burden and a tool. She disliked it, but she accepted its necessity. She organized citizen patrols to keep the peace. She established a fair court, with Mr. Miller as the provisional judge, where disputes were settled openly and honestly. She was forging the chaotic storm of the uprising into a structure of order and purpose. She was turning a riot into a revolution. But a larger shadow still loomed. Silas Granger may have been defeated, but he was just a symptom of a larger disease. He had partners, influential men in the territorial capital who had a vested interest in maintaining the old order. Word of what had happened in Purgatory Flats would surely reach them. That problem arrived in the form of a territorial deputy governor named Sterling, a man with a soft face and sharp eyes whose name appeared numerous times in Granger's ledger. He arrived in Purgatory Flats with an escort of 20 heavily armed cavalrymen, not to investigate, but to restore order. He called a meeting with Maggie's council. "What has happened here is an act of insurrection against the lawful authorities," Sterling declared, his voice full of self-importance. "Silas Granger will be released, and his property restored. You, the ringleaders of this mob, will be arrested and tried for treason." The council looked to Maggie. This was their true test. They could stand up to a local tyrant, but could they stand up to the government? Maggie did not flinch. She placed a copy of the ledger on the table in front of Sterling. "Mr. Granger was deposed by the people of this town for the crimes documented in this book," she said, her voice calm and cold. "Crimes, I might add, that involve your name numerous times." Sterling's face darkened. "Those are lies and fabrications." "Then let the people decide," Maggie said. "We are not a mob. We are a community. We have elected this council. We have established our own court. We claim the right to self-governance. If you want to arrest us, you will have to arrest every man, woman, and child in this town, because we are all a part of it." She stood and looked him directly in the eye. "You may have soldiers, but we have the truth. And we have the will. Let's see which is stronger." Sterling was trapped. He could see that this was not some small uprising. It was a movement. To perpetrate a massacre in Purgatory Flats would create a political scandal he could not survive. And Maggie had shrewdly implied that she knew of his own involvement. He made a political decision. "This matter requires further investigation," he said stiffly. "I will be back." He left, his troopers in his wake. Maggie and the others knew this was only a reprieve, not a victory. But it was a crucial one. They had faced a greater power, and they had not backed down. They had proven that Purgatory Flats was no longer a lawless outpost. It was a fortress, and Maggie Dawson was its commander. The storm was no longer just a local wind. It was sending its first clouds out across the territory, and the men of power were beginning to take notice. The departure of Deputy Governor Sterling brought no peace. It was merely the calm eye of the hurricane. Maggie and her council knew they had poked a much larger snake than Silas Granger. They had challenged not just a man, but a corrupt system. The response was sure to come, and it would be brutal. They used their precious time to prepare. Purgatory Flats transformed into an armed camp. Under the tutelage of Tommy and Mr. Miller, the farmers and workers began to drill, learning to shoot and act as a coordinated unit. Malin organized stockpiles of food and medical supplies. The town was no longer a collection of frightened individuals. It was a community ready to fight for its newfound freedom. Maggie was the center of it all. She was a tireless strategist, an organizer, a symbol. She moved through the town, her very presence an inspiration. She no longer carried the fragility of her past. In her eyes was a cold clarity, the will of a leader who had accepted her burden. The storm broke 2 weeks later. An army of 50 mercenaries, hardened killers hired privately by a consortium of the wealthy ranchers and corrupt politicians Sterling represented, rode into the valley. They were led by a man named Captain Thorne, a ruthless ex-military officer who viewed this as not an act of law enforcement, but of pest extermination. They did not ask for surrender. They began by burning the outlying farms. Their message was clear: submit or be annihilated. But Purgatory Flats did not submit. When the mercenaries advanced on the town itself, they were not met by a terrified mob. They were met by an organized resistance. The battle for Purgatory Flats had begun. It was not a conventional fight. Maggie knew they couldn't face a better equipped force in a straight-up gun battle. They had to use their knowledge of the town, their resourcefulness, and their desperation as weapons. They turned the town into a death trap. Alleys were barricaded. Snipers were placed on rooftops. The Chinese laborers, using their knowledge of blasting powder, created makeshift explosive devices. Maggie did not command from the rear. She was in the thick of it, not with a gun, but with her mind. She directed her forces, moving from position to position, exploiting the enemy's weaknesses, anticipating their moves. She was the queen on her own violent chessboard. The battle raged all day and into the night. The town burned. The gunfire was ceaseless. It was a hell of smoke, fire, and screams. But the people of Purgatory Flats fought with the ferocity of those with nothing left to lose. They were fighting for their homes, for their dignity, for the woman who had given them hope. The climax of the battle came at the Gilded Cage Saloon, where Captain Thorne had made his headquarters. Pinned down and taking heavy losses, Thorne and the last of his men were trapped. Maggie confronted him. She walked through the swinging doors of the saloon, alone and armed, into the lion's den one last time. The room fell silent as every mercenary leveled his gun at her. "Thorne," she said, her voice echoing in the smoky room. "Look out the window." Thorne, his face black with soot and fury, did. He saw that the saloon was not just surrounded by men with guns. It was surrounded by the entire town. Every man, woman, and older child was standing there, silently, holding whatever they could find: shotguns, pitchforks, clubs. They were a human wall, a sea of defiance. "Your men are beaten," Maggie said, her voice calm. "You've lost more than half of them. You can die here, or you can leave and tell the men who sent you that Purgatory Flats is no longer for sale." Thorne looked into her eyes, and he did not see a girl. He saw a general. He saw a will that could not be broken. And he was a practical man. He had been paid to quell an uprising, not to die in a pointless martyrdom. He ordered his men to lower their weapons. They rode out of Purgatory Flats the next morning, a beaten, humiliated column, watched by the silent eyes of the town they could not break. The victory had come, but at a great cost. The town was heavily damaged. Many had died, including Preacher Jones, who had fallen defending a barricade, but they had survived. They had faced the greatest storm, and they had held. In the days after the battle, a legend was born. The story of Purgatory Flats, the town that had freed itself, and of the woman who had led them, began to spread across the territory. They were no longer called rebels. They were called freemen. And Maggie Dawson, the girl who had been bought for $10 silver, was now a name whispered with around campfires and in the councils of the powerful. She had become something more than a leader. She had become a myth. The storm had broken, and it had washed the old world away. Now came the hard work of building a new one from the ruins. In the aftermath of the battle, Purgatory Flats was a place of ghosts and new beginnings. The scars of the conflict were etched on the buildings and in the hearts of the people. But for the first time, the air was not heavy with fear. It smelled of ash, but also of possibility. In the silence after the storm, Maggie Dawson stood as the epicenter of it all. She had not sought power, but it had found her. She was the one who had faced Granger, who had defied the government, who had defeated a mercenary army. She had earned the right to lead not through conquest, but through sacrifice and an indomitable will. She became the crowned queen of Purgatory Flats, but her reign was not one of tyranny. It was one of consensus. The town council, forged and hardened by their shared fight, became the region's true government. They drafted a simple charter, a set of laws based on fairness and common rights. They elected Tommy Hayes as the new sheriff, his decency and courage the best guarantee of a just peace. Silas Granger, forgotten in his cell, never stood trial. One night, he was found dead, a makeshift shiv in his ribs. No one knew who did it. A vengeful rancher, a former henchman tying up loose ends, and no one asked. His end was as quiet and ignominious as his reign had been loud. He was simply erased. The news of Purgatory Flats' victory had a ripple effect. Other small ranches and towns, long groaning under the heel of corrupt cattle barons and greedy politicians, saw an example. They saw that chains could be broken. Delegations began to arrive in Purgatory Flats, not to conquer, but to learn. Maggie shared their story, not as a boast, but as a blueprint for freedom. She became the central fire of a spreading movement, a political storm that was reshaping the entire territory. But for Maggie, the victory was bittersweet. She had led her people to freedom, but she had lost a part of herself in the process. The softness, the vulnerability, the girl who had once dreamed of a quiet life had all been burned away in the fires of revolution. She was respected, feared, but also isolated by her own legend. One evening, as she stood on a hill overlooking her rebuilding town, Tommy came to her side. "This town owes you everything," he said softly. "It took everything from me," she replied, a note of weariness in her voice that she rarely let show. "It didn't take you, Maggie," he said. "It revealed you." He gestured to the town below, where lights were beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "That's you. Every rebuilt home, every planted field, every child who laughs in the street without fear. That's your legacy." He took her hand, and in his touch, she felt a familiar warmth, a reminder of the boy who had believed in her when no one else had. "You don't have to be alone in this," he said. "You never were." Maggie looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than the weight of responsibility. She felt a flicker of hope, not for a town, but for herself. She never married. She never had children. Her life was given to her people, to the idea of a free Purgatory Flats. She remained their strategist, their mediator, their conscience. She grew old, and so did her legend. Years later, when the railroads had come and the territory had become a state, Purgatory Flats remained a different sort of place. It was a place known for its fierce independence and its uncompromising fairness. It was an island of equality in a world still full of Grangers and thorns. And at the heart of it all was the story of a woman who had been bought for $10 and had risen to lead a revolution. They called her Maggie the Storm, and they said that on quiet nights, you could still hear her voice on the wind that swept through the valley, a whisper of strength, a reminder that even the smallest spark can set the world on fire. She stood, a final silhouette on the hill, looking out over the wasteland she had tamed, not by force, but by will. She was no longer a girl, a victim, or even a queen. She was a symbol, a living testament to the truth that freedom is not something that is given, but something that is taken sometimes, by a storm with a woman's name.